When we think of the term ethics, we think naturally about rules, what's allowed, what's forbidden, and then how close we can actually get to the line without crossing it. Now, ethics are involved in every single aspect of how we live our daily lives. They're a part of our relationships, our work, even our entertainment. On a January afternoon in 2015, as the NFL's playoff spotlight zeroed in on Gillette Stadium in Foxborough, Massachusetts, the New England Patriots dominated the Indianapolis Colts 45-7 to advance to the Super Bowl. But in the shadow of that blowout win wasn't how the game was won with X's and O's, but really how the role of PSI determined the game. You see, under league rules, NFL footballs must be inflated to between 12.5 and 13.5 PSA before games. For quarterbacks, especially one like Tom Brady, who preferred a softer grip, even small changes in air pressure can feel meaningful and give them an advantage in being able to grip and throw a football. So after the AFC Championship, the Colts complained that Patriots footballs seemed underinflated. And when NFL officials tested the balls at halftime, they found that 11 of the 12 were below the legal range, enough to raise serious questions. And in response, the league launched an investigation, and they found that the Patriots equipment staff deliberately deflated footballs, and that Tom Brady likely was generally aware of it. Now, the NFL punished the Patriots with a $1 million fine, the loss of 2 draft picks, and a 4-game suspension for Tom Brady, a penalty that would be fought in court and ultimately upheld. So while not necessarily discussed today quite like it was 10 years ago, Deflategate is still remembered, and it's part of Tom Brady's legacy, whether he wants it to be or not. You know, it's interesting to see how our natural human bent is to do what is easiest and most beneficial for us in the moment, not necessarily what is right. And while we may not be technically breaking any rules, we get as close as we can while still trying to be able to publicly maintain our innocence. Even the most disciplined of individuals, men like Tom Brady, who is disciplined when it comes to his craft, or recently the famous Christian author Philip Yancey, who confessed to an 8-year-long extramarital affair, even men like that can make decisions in the blink of an eye that are contrary to what they know to be true. In Matthew 5:17 through 48, Jesus shares with his new disciples and the crowd that has gathered on the mountain a reiteration of some of the commands that God gave to Moses regarding things like murder, adultery, divorce, and how to treat your enemies. Jesus' intent in talking over these things is because they are a part of the inward manifestation of righteousness that he has already talked about beginning to work its way out of them. And it's important for us to understand here that Jesus mentioning these different subjects in his Sermon on the Mount, this is not an attempt for him to lower God's standards, but instead deepen those standards by transforming the heart behind the actions. And really, that is the ultimate goal here that both God and Jesus want us to grasp. We need to be people whose hearts are totally transformed, and that we become salt and light by living out that transformation in a radical, godly way. So Jesus starts at the beginning by reframing for his listeners what righteousness means. They've all got their own preconceived ideas. Many of them are probably closely built on what they believe to be God's desires. Yet they aren't properly focused on the truth. And the truth is this: Jesus came to give a righteousness that we cannot attain or obtain on our own. Jesus puts it like this in Matthew 5:17 through 20 by saying, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish them, but to fulfill them. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth disappear, not the smallest letter, not the least stroke of a pen will by any means disappear from the law until everything is accomplished. Therefore, anyone who sets aside one of the least of these commands and teaches others accordingly will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever practices and teaches these commands will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you that unless your righteousness surpasses that of the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven." Now, Jesus has begun by addressing a concern that those listening to him probably had. Is he dismissing the law? So he quite clearly wants to answer this question with an emphatic no. Jesus doesn't abolish or replace the law. He fulfills it. We've got to really, really understand this, though. Fulfillment doesn't mean reduction. What it means is completion and clarification. And so when Jesus says that our righteousness has to surpass that of the scribes and the Pharisees, it's not him calling for stricter rule keeping on our part. What he is doing is he's exposing the truth that these scribes, teachers of the law, and Pharisees, they may look good on the outside, but their hearts have not been transformed like they should. He's saying our righteousness doesn't come from what we look like on the outside, how we measure up to the people around us, or what we do. Our kingdom righteousness is measured by our alignment with God's heart. And so really, folks, we've got to see this. This is about relationship. When you really love someone, the love that you feel for them, it shows up in what you do. Truly loving someone involves listening to their heart, doing what they ask of you when it's not irrational, sacrificing of yourself for them, and seeking to know them better so that you can do things that grow the relationship you have with them. What Jesus is talking about here in verse 17 through 20 is calling for us to be so in love with God that we care too much about what pleases God and keeps us in right relationship with Him. And so this reframing that Jesus talks about shifts the focus away from what can I get away with to who am I becoming? And so do you see here the ethics of God's kingdom isn't about our external compliance to the laws. Instead, it's about the inward transformation that's happening. The fruit of that transformation is seen in what we do. The fruit is not what saves us. Jesus saves us. The fruit is what those who have been saved act like. And so Jesus moves on by giving us some concrete examples of this. The examples he uses are focused on anger and lust. Why? Because they're internal conflicts we have that manifest themselves externally. Now, these two examples show that it's our heart that is the battleground of our obedience. The battleground for our salvation. It's not external, it's internal. Let's look here at verses 21 through 30 in Matthew 5. You've heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raka, is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled to them, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown in prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny. You've heard it said that you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to stumble, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to stumble, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. Now, what Jesus does here is take commandments that every single one of his listeners was familiar with, and he moves the spotlight from the subject matter to the deeper issues that lie below the surface and in our hearts. Murder begins with unresolved anger. Adultery begins with unchecked lust. So while it might look like Jesus is taking what the law says to the extreme in an attempt to shock those who are listening, what he's actually doing is diagnosing the real problem. You see, sin isn't something that suddenly appears in our actions. It's something that grows quietly in our hearts. And by the time it shows up for other people to see, it's already taken root privately. And Jesus, talking about this, doesn't minimize our sin problem. Instead, he's helping us see just how seriously we need to take it. Because anytime you just address the symptoms of sin, you're going to ultimately fail. You have to go to the source. You have to go into your heart. And you have to change what's happening internally in your life that is causing your actions to be sinful. Now, Jesus doesn't stop with anger and lust, though. He keeps pressing into other areas where people who are listening to him were convinced that they were doing just fine ethically, but they were completely missing God's heart. In verse 31 through 42, Jesus addresses things like divorce, oaths, and revenge, not as isolated moral issues, but as windows into the condition of the heart. Now, first, Jesus talks about divorce in verses 31 through 32. At the time, divorce had become disturbingly casual. Men in particular could justify ending a marriage for almost any reason as long as they followed the proper legal process. Now, the question wasn't, is this honoring to God, but am I technically allowed to do this? And Jesus says, essentially, even asking that question already reveals the problem. Marriage in God's design isn't about personal convenience or contractual loopholes. It's about covenant faithfulness. And so Jesus isn't minimizing the reality of brokenness or the pain that many people carry in this area. What he's doing is exposing how easily selfishness can disguise itself as righteousness. Divorce in this context becomes another example of how we justify harming others when our hearts are more committed to ourselves than to God's purposes. And so kingdom righteousness, on the other hand, it asks a deeper question. Am I being faithful, sacrificial, and loving the way God has been faithful, sacrificial, and loving to me? Then Jesus moves to talking about oaths in verses 33 through 37. The issue here isn't just about swearing or making promises, it's about truthfulness. The religious leaders had developed an elaborate system of vows that allowed them to sound honest while still leaving themselves room to wiggle out of that commitment later. They were managing appearances instead of living with integrity. And Jesus cuts right through all of that and says, let your yes be yes and your no be no. In other words, kingdom people don't need verbal tricks or legal language to prove they're trustworthy. When God has transformed your heart, truthfulness becomes your default setting. You don't tell the truth because you're afraid of getting caught. You tell the truth because your life is aligned with the God who is truth. And then Jesus goes even further by addressing revenge in verses 38 through 42. He says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for tooth. Now that phrase was originally meant to limit revenge, to keep punishment from spiraling out of control. But by Jesus' day, what it had become was a justification for retaliation. You hurt me, so I get to hurt you back. Instead of image and grace, instead of retaliation, these teachings aren't random moral commands. They're symptoms pointing to the same deeper question. What and who is ruling your heart? All of this comes to head in verses 43 through 48, where Jesus says this. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. And so this is where everything Jesus has been saying reaches its climax. After talking about anger, lust, selfishness in relationships, truth and revenge, Jesus doesn't just tell us what to avoid, he tells us what should define us, which is love. And not just love that is easy or convenient, not even a love that's reserved for people who agree with us, vote like us, look like us, treat us well, or who are our loved ones. Jesus says the defining ethic of his kingdom is love that looks like the Father's love, generous, patient, undeserved, and often costly. And when Jesus says, love your enemies, he isn't being poetic or trying to be revolutionary. He's being painfully practical. He's saying that kingdom righteousness shows itself most clearly not in how we treat people who are easy to love, but in how we respond to those who hurt us, those who oppose us, or don't even deserve our kindness. This kind of love is what reveals whether our hearts have actually been transformed or not. And when Jesus says, be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect, he's not calling us to flawlessness. He's calling us to completeness, to a mature, wholehearted love that reflects God's character. The word that Jesus uses there carries the idea of being fully formed, fully grown, not divided. Here's how C.S. Lewis puts it in Mere Christianity. Some people seem to think this means, unless you are perfect, I will not help you. And as we cannot be perfect, then if he meant that, our position is hopeless. But I do not think he did mean that. I think he meant, the only help I will give is help to become perfect. You may want something less, but I will give you nothing less. In other words, Jesus is saying, let your love be consistent, let it match who your Father is. Later in Matthew 22, 37 through 40, Jesus will be asked what the greatest commandment is, and he'll say this, love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment, and the second is like it, love your neighbor as yourself. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commandments. That's the key. Everything Jesus has said in Matthew 5, every command, every correction, every heart-level challenge hangs on love. Love is not the exception to God's commands. Love is the fulfillment of them. And this is why kingdom ethics can never just be about behavior management, because you can modify behavior without loving God. You can follow rules without having a transformed heart. You can modify behavior and not care one bit about your fellow human. But you cannot love the way that Jesus is calling us to love unless God is doing something deep inside of you. The Apostle Paul puts flesh on this kind of love in Romans 12 when he says things like, hate what is evil, cling to what is good. Bless those who persecute you. Do not repay anyone evil for evil. Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. Then in Galatians 5, Paul reminds us that this kind of love isn't produced by trying harder. It's actually just the fruit of the Spirit at work within us. Look at verses 22 through 23 there. It lets us know that those things are love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And Paul says, against such things there is no law. That's what kingdom righteousness looks like when it grows. So here's the question that Jesus has been asking throughout this entire sermon so far. Are we content with looking righteous, or do we actually want to be transformed? Because kingdom ethics aren't about being impressive. In fact, they quite often are unseen and unnoticeable. They aren't about winning arguments, proving points, or staying just on the right side of the line. They're about becoming people whose hearts look more and more like the heart of our Father. Jesus isn't asking, how close can you get to sin without crossing into it? He's asking, who are you becoming as you follow me? And that's the challenge for us this week, not simply to ask, what should I do differently, but to ask, what does God want to change in my heart? Where is there anger that needs healing? Where is there desire that needs surrender? Where am I selfish in my relationships? Where am I lying because the truth is just too hard to confront? Where am I delighting in seeking someone else's suffering? Where is there someone I'm struggling to love the way God has loved me? A greater righteousness doesn't begin with our actions. It begins with a transformed heart and a love that reflects the King that we follow. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.